Hey guys, and welcome to the new format of In Our Neighborhood. I'm Shoshani, and in this show and all the following shows, we get to sit down with some clever and unique individuals to learn in depth about what's happening in this part of the world. And on today's show, we have Jonathan Spyer, who's both a repeated guest on many of the shows we produce here in Israel, but also a really deep expert of everything that happens here in the Middle East. And not just from a philosophical perspective, he's also been on the ground around the Middle East, both in Syria and close to Iran, even in recent weeks. So let's hear our interview with Jonathan Spyer. Welcome, Jonathan Spyer. It's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Matty.
And for those of our viewers who don't know who you are, we get to talk to a lot of experts. You really have gone deep on the topic of Iran, the topic of Syria, and been on the ground in these places for many years. Mm-hmm. And seen things that very few people, even in Israel in the intelligence community, have been able to see. I want to talk today about the idea of the axis of evil. The axis of evil that is Iran and its influence in the Middle East. And maybe you can sort of take us into the mind of the people of Iran, the government, and how their actions look in this region. An overall view of what is going on in this region and how they're influencing different events.
Yes, sure. So the first thing I would say, Matty, to bear in mind regarding Iran is that there is a very clear and interesting contrast between the state of affairs inside Iran and Iranian regime activities across the region. And the contrast is that inside Iran, the regime is in some disarray. The regime is not managing the country successfully. The Iranian economy is in a mess. They have an unemployment rate of 9%. They have an inflation rate of 38.5%. The Iranian rial, the currency, is at its lowest point against the dollar for many years. So the country is being mismanaged to a very high level. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, is old, in his mid-80s. He's trying hard to preserve what he regards as his legacy. One of the ways he's doing that is by trying to introduce very ideological, very extreme, hardline officials into the key positions of state. The result of that is that in the key positions of state, affairs are being mismanaged. Unsurprisingly, when you introduce zealots that don't have skills instead of technocrats who have skills, you get chaos as a result. That's what's happening inside Iran. But by contrast, if you look at the Iranian impact on the region, the Arabic-speaking Middle East, then the Iranians are doing extremely well. And that is because in a specific area of activity, and maybe only in that area of activity, but it's an important area of activity, the Iranians excel. And that is in the area of building political and military proxy organizations across the region so that they can serve the interests of Islamic Republic of Iran. This, of course, was the area of activity of the late Major General Qasem Soleimani, assassinated by the Americans in Baghdad, outside Baghdad in January 2020. Many people thought that at that point, the Iranian skill in this area would subside. It hasn't done so. It turned out that Qasem Soleimani had had enough time to formalize and institutionalize his vision and his methods such that even when he disappeared from the scene, these have continued. As a result, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and among the Palestinians and the Palestinian territories too, the Iranian influence is at an all-time high, and it is producing very serious capacity, so to speak, adapted to local circumstances in all the areas in which the Iranians, and specifically, of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is the body that has developed this method and practice of irregular warfare. So in all these areas, the Iranians are doing very well, are advancing forward. I would say their enemies have not yet found a way to adequately respond. I would go as far as to say that to Iranian methods, even at a time when the regime inside Iran itself is in some disarray and disorder.
So you present this very interesting picture where they're not doing very well internally, but they've done incredibly well externally in exporting terrorism and exporting violence and being agents of chaos throughout the Middle East.
Exactly. There's been a lot of luck as well. Some of the moves that their opponents have made over the last couple of decades have ended up helping them. And they've been helped also by objective political circumstances and conditions. What do I mean by that? With regard to moves made by the opponents, the American and Allied invasion of Iraq in 2003
I see what you're saying.
rid the world of a very terrible and cruel dictatorship, of course, that of Saddam Hussein, but it also inadvertently played the role of opening the door to the region, to the Iranians and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, because Saddam was obviously a terrible and brutal ruler. But also another function he happened to perform was he acted as a kind of wall, preventing the Iranians from pushing westwards. Once he was gone, they flooded into the gap, not only in Iraq, but also in Syria and beyond it. As you know, in 2010, 2011, a wave of revolutions and of internal instability began in the Arab world, which was initially, of course, misnamed the Arab Spring. Yeah. Nobody called it that for very long, but it turned out not to be a spring at all.
Not very spring-like.
Not very spring-like, but it turned out to be a massive, wave of instability and disorder across the region. The result of the Arab Spring, as we now know, was not the birth of democratic governance anywhere in the region, really, but rather the fragmentation and even partial collapse of a significant number of Arab states, including Yemen, Syria, and most importantly among them, and to a degree also Iraq. And once again, it has been the Iranians, and specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, that has managed most effectively to enter that vacuum. As it turns out, and maybe unsurprisingly, a state that possesses an organization whose specific skill set really is the raising up of proxy political and military organizations, that state will enjoy a huge advantage operating in a situation in which state authority in any given country has partially collapsed or fragmented, and in which wars of succession are underway. Well, there's a bunch of guys who they're very...
So you're saying because the Iranians' MO is destabilizing and causing chaos, when there's instability and chaos, they capitalize on it very well.
Absolutely right. And again, they are failing on most of the indicators of state success. But in this particular area, they're doing very well. And this happens to be an area of profound strategic importance to the Middle East region at the present time.
I'm trying to understand, wrap my mind around what is going through the leadership of that country's head and the people on the street, where their country is spending enormous amounts of money and sending their best minds and and capable individuals outside of the country to cause chaos, and internally the country's crumbling from what we hear.
Yeah.
Like how do they live within that tension?
What I hear is that there is a relatively small percentage of people who support the regime in Iran. My friends have told me, and various people have told me, 10 to 15% maybe of the population. But these are people who themselves and their families have benefited materially, enormously from the association with the regime. Many of them are people from poor families originally, and the family has become wealthy and powerful as a result of the connection to the regime. These are the people who are going abroad on behalf of Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, among other things, and who serve it also at home. And they serve it also at home by crewing its tools of repression. And its tools and capacities of repression are very well developed indeed. We should remind ourselves, in 2022 and 2023, Iran faced its most determined campaign of internal opposition that it had faced at any time since 1979, since the Islamic Revolution, the so-called woman life freedom revolt or demonstrations, which began after the murder of an Iranian Kurdish woman, Mahsa Jina Amini, for reportedly improper wearing of her compulsory veil, her hijab, by the Iranian regime authorities. So this was a very serious campaign of opposition. In the end, it has failed. It is now largely dispersed. The regime succeeded in crushing it. It doesn't mean the regime will succeed in crushing the next round. And there will be a next round of discontent without any questions.
Complicated world. So let's look at what we're living in right now. We're in Israel, 7 months into the October 7th attack on Israel. And part of that has been sort of dealing with one threat posed by the Iranian proxies, I guess, for lack of a better word, after the other. Houthis in the Red Sea, threats from up north from the Hezbollah, their proteges, our northern neighbors. And Hamas, of course, also are sponsored to a certain degree by the Iranians. What is their current sort of stronghold on different powers look like, and where are they going from there?
Yeah, first of all, let me say that I think that the Iranians, they have mobilized partially in support of Hamas, which is their client, as you correctly point out, but I think that they've tried hard to avoid a full mobilization. Because it appears they do not want an all-out war at the present time with Israel or indeed with the West. So they have mobilized, but it's been a partial mobilization. They mobilized, as you correctly point out, in Lebanon. This was the first mobilization in support of Hamas. Hamas obviously carried out October 7th, and October 8th already, Lebanese Hezbollah began to fire on Israel. And then in November, the Houthis began their campaign of attacks against shipping and the key global maritime trading route, the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea up to the Suez Canal. There have also been tens of attacks on US and allied forces in Iraq and in Syria. And up until now, those are the main components of what's taken place. I think they've been careful not to go beyond a certain level of intensity in terms of the attacks. There was, of course, the April 13th open, direct Iranian air attack on Israel after Israel killed an Iranian general, Mohammad Reza Zahedi, in Damascus. Analysts and experts remain divided as to the extent of Iranian intentions that night. They certainly lobbed a huge amount of ordnance at Israel, both drones and ballistic missiles. Most of it, of course, was taken down by Israel and the kind of de facto air defense alliance which Israel has around it. And the question was, what did the Iranians want? Did they want just to make a statement, or was that intended to start potentially a much larger conflict? I can't, of course, be in the minds of the people of the Iranian regime, but I do note the fact that the most potent asset they have against Israel is Lebanese Hezbollah, with its 150,000 rockets and missiles right there on the border.
That's your point.
And it's interesting that they kept Hezbollah out of April the 13th. So my sense from that is that there's at least some indication that this wasn't intended to be a sort of Pearl Harbor moment, so to speak. They were trying to say to Israel, don't try and hit somebody on the level of General Zahedi again, and so we'll see if Israel chooses to obey or to defy. It's too soon to tell right now. But what I think we learned from that is that they were not, and I think are not, looking for all-out war against Israel. The reason why they're not is because they think their current strategy is going pretty well. The current strategy being to try, frankly, to slowly bleed Israel to death by the practice of building Islamist armies on Israel's borders, Arab Islamist armies, not Iranian Islamist armies, who then carry out a long war of attrition against Israel. So far, they have two such Islamist armies. Hezbollah in Lebanon is the strongest. Hamas in Gaza, which, as we know from October 7th, is by no means inconsequential, is the second one. And they're trying hard on a daily basis to fill up the West Bank or Judea and Samaria with weaponry, which they're bringing in from Syria via Jordan, with the intention of building up Islamist client militias in the West Bank as well. What does that all look like? It looks like trying to surround Israel and then subject Israel to a kind of long war or death by 1,000 cuts. They want to continue with that strategy. They don't like it when Israel kills Iranians. They don't really care when Israel kills Arabs. As far as they're concerned, their Arab clients are more or less dispensable. In terms of what you asked about their relative power in the region, today Iran essentially owns Lebanon. Mm-hmm. Lebanon is the longest standing Iranian paramilitary investment, going all the way back to 1982 when they began to form the Hezbollah movement. And Lebanon is pretty much in their hands today. It's pretty clear. With regard to Yemen, they have their Houthi client rather than proxy movement. It controls the capital, Sana'a, and a swathe of the territory of Yemen, not the entirety of the territory, but a good percentage of the population. And then they are dominant also, I would say, in Iraq. And in Syria, they have freedom of action. That's pretty much what it looks like in terms of their regional commitments and power.
It's a very alarming picture that you paint. They're playing a game where it's never to the point of we're going to go and exchange direct blows. We're going to play it out, but never escalate to the point where everyone has to respond.
Yeah, that's right.
And they're a lot better at that than we are, from what I can tell.
They're better at that than we are, and we are better at what we do than they are.
Well, what is it we do?
Conventional warfare. Yeah. Conventional warfare, conventional diplomacy, and conventional intelligence work. In all those areas, we are far superior to the Iranian regime. And we have an example, we apparently have an example, if we look at Israel's response to the April 13th attack. It was very small, it was very pinpointed. It appears that an S-300 air defense battery was targeted, and that battery appears to have been targeted by somebody or other who is operating inside Iran. Israel apparently possesses some kind of organization inside Iran, which it can activate at will, which you switch it on and it organizes and does whatever it needs to do. maybe it helps to kill Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, for example, the father of the Iranian nuclear program, who of course was assassinated outside Tehran a couple of years ago. Or maybe a drone factory, this is also an actual example, in Kermanshah mysteriously explodes just over a year ago. These things are being carried out by a network inside Iran itself. That speaks to Israel's superior capacities at conventional intelligence work. The Iranians have nothing remotely and could not set up anything remotely comparable to that. We think of conventional diplomatic activity as well. We described a moment ago the attempt that Iran is making to envelop Israel with proxy Islamist militias in West Bank, Lebanon, and Gaza. But we know also that Israel has been busy with diplomacy, building up relations with Azerbaijan, building up relations with the United Arab Emirates, trying hard to advance relations with Saudi Arabia, building up relations with Bahrain. Look, if you look at the map, you see what that consists of. It consists of a counter-envelopment by Israel of Iran. So what do we have there? We have conventional diplomatic activity, conventional intelligence activity, and conventional military activity. And in all three of those, Israel has vastly superior capacities to Iran, and Iran has very little answer. But what Iran excels at is something that Israel and the West find very hard to do, which is what we've been describing, which is proxy, political, and military warfare. And as of now, a way to roll that back has not yet been located.
I mean, is there a response to something like that? I'm thinking on a philosophical level, governments who are intent on peace and the well-being of their citizens, sort of by the nature of their own governance, don't want to pursue a never-ending war.
Yeah, that's right.
And governments who are focused on the export of an ideology that is both violent and also negatively consumes like whatever population it takes over, they're always going to want to continue with that ongoing battle. Unless we're willing to sort of cut off the head of the snake, which is in a very extreme, chain of events, you're never going to really solve the issue unless it implodes internally.
First of all, I think it's a matter of urgency for the democracies to comprehend that this is happening, that there is a problem, that there is a strategic effort to undermine the US-led, let us say, order in the Middle East and to replace it with something else. My sense is that the West is not yet at that stage of understanding. I think that there is still a tendency to believe that the Iranian regime can be appeased, can be negotiated with, maybe can be normalized. This certainly characterizes the Biden administration's attitude towards the Iranian regime, the desperate attempt, for example, to get back to the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, and the willingness to allow billions of dollars to come back online for the Iranian regime as part of the efforts to do that. These indicate there is not yet any such strategic understanding. I want to add an additional point, which is the following. Once you've come to that strategic level of understanding of the nature of the challenge, you can begin to target, and you have many levers to target Iran internally, because Iran internally, as we said at the beginning, is in a lot of trouble. Once you've understood the importance of the moment and what needs to be done, there's plenty of targets there. This is one point which I think is crucial, because Israel and other local powers can fight against the local proxies here and there, and Israel is doing so in Gaza at the moment, of course, in a very kinetic way. But at the end of the day, the only way you can really address this problem is by addressing the force which is sending out these proxies and facilitating and enabling their capacities, and that's Iran itself. The thing about destruction is that it only gets you so far, and the only thing which the Iranian regime has is destructiveness, i.e. it's very good at raising up militias of angry young guys and putting weapons in their hands and training them how to use them quite effectively. And it's even good at combining that with political power and political activity, sometimes even in contexts where there are elections and electoral structures, such as Lebanon and Iraq. But one thing which is absolutely not good at is economic activity. Impoverishment and eventual economic collapse accompany the Iranian takeover of countries. Eventually that must also have its effect. And that's something which the enemies of Iran can also help and hope to leverage. The regime itself is weak. It's doing destruction, if you like, inside Iran. That makes it vulnerable, but you need to understand the extent of the problem, and then you can begin to develop a strategy for effective counteraction.
I struggle with this. Like, how do you get to that moment of clarity to move people to action against something that is proven and spoken actively and openly about? We are a force that is going to do destruction and evil in this world, and yet people struggle with the response to that. Nations struggle with the response to that.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I would say that history often shows us that that moment of clarity comes when countries themselves are hit. As when a country itself or a society itself experiences the pain of the kind of attacks that these forces can produce, then you get a moment of clarity. Often though those moments of clarity are relatively short-lived, it appears to me there is a public and a growing public in Western countries which does not itself have a particularly coherent or even any commitment at all to the preservation of its own society, and doesn't have a particularly coherent, well-developed view which understands why its own society should be preserved and why many of the freedoms and many of the possibilities and capacities of its society are worthy of preservation and indeed worthy of being spread and worthy of educating other countries to adopt those norms and those practices. You know, Iran, which we've been discussing, today can increasingly be seen as a component of a broader global challenge to the West and to Western norms, which includes also Russia, which of course is conducting a very large-scale war in Ukraine, which includes also China, whose economic strength stands behind much of what both Russia and Iran are able to do. And I would say that a fourth component of that, it increasingly appears to me, is that population within the Western world, within Western countries, that is no longer committed to the norms and key values of those countries, and in many ways may be actively committed to norms and values that are the opposite, that are opposed to the mainstream foundations, so to speak, of Western societies.
Well, Jonathan, I want to thank you for coming, stopping by the studio. And I think this conversation is just testament to how complex the world we live in is. So many agendas, so many people. You've given me a lot to think on in coming days.
Thanks, Mary. Yes, it is indeed a complex picture, and we're doing our best to understand it on a daily basis.
If you like learning about what happens here in the Middle East, and you like the content that we create, I encourage you to go and support the work we do here in Israel. Now, even if it's a small amount of money, visit one of our websites or the Facebook page or the YouTube page, and there's a link over there that will take you to a place where you can donate or pledge to donate on a regular basis. And I know a small amount of money doesn't seem to make a big difference, but every dollar counts. Every dollar helps us create more content, keep our team running, and tell you the stories of what really happens here on the ground in Israel. Hello, this is Mati here in Jerusalem with TBN Israel.
This is Yair Pinto from TBN Israel here in Jerusalem. TBN Israel is keeping viewers informed with Israel-focused news, culture, and what God is doing in this land.
Support TBN Israel today online at tbn.org/Israel. Thank you.